G'day YouTube, Warbles on a lot here, and I'm about to crack the top off my third Coopers of the day, and as well as my chair set up, I've got the vise on the tripod, lined up with the radio. The fire's going, and there's plenty of firewood. So, time for a bit of a malt liquor video and a fireside radio documentary. The theory is that the ABC is going to run a 6-part series, 5:30 in the afternoon on Sundays, called Mongrel Nation. And today is part 1, which I'm going to break up into a couple of 15-minute segments, or maybe a bit more than 15 minutes, because there's this little introduction on the front of the first one. So, Warbles on a lot to YouTube. Let's find out what Mongrel Nation is all about. Malt liquor. Here's Mongrel Nation.
You may think this sounds like a street in Asia, but I'm here in Cabramatta, in Sydney southwest. As you walk down the main street, you can see that the noodle houses are packed, that the shopping arcades are doing a good trade. I grew up not far from here in the 1980s and 90s. Back then, Cabramatta was regarded as a troubled badland. Now, Cabramatta is a multicultural success story. I'm Tim Supamassan, and this is Mongrel Nation, the story of Australian multiculturalism. Over the next 6 weeks, I'll take you through the debates that have defined us as an immigrant nation. Does multiculturalism work? Is Australia racist? Why are we so anxious about boat people? And are we ready to become a big Australia, or part of the Asian century? Through all of this, you'll see some of the contradictions, some of the best and the worst of Australia. Yes, we are a country built by immigrants with an identity to match. Yet for all that has been achieved, we still have our moments of mongrel. In this first episode, the life and times of Australian multiculturalism. How did we get to where we are today? The writer, David Malouf.
Yeah, it's very interesting when you look at the composition of the First Fleet. You know, there were only 560 people or whatever. They were mostly English. There were very few Scots and there were very few Irish. But there was something like 7 or 8 Jews, a handful, about probably 7 or 8, also black men. One of them a Jamaican, the others people who came from England. And that was to say that England was itself a multicultural society, so that when it set up, Australia at the beginning was multicultural.
But if Australia was diverse from the start, it still considered itself proudly British. It wasn't until the arrival of new Australians after the Second World War that this came under challenge.
The mission on which I am now embarking is vital to the nation. I am going abroad to seek ships for immigrants. Without immigration, the future of the Australia we know will be both uneasy and brief.
Australia's first Minister for Immigration, Arthur Calwell. Populate or perish was the order of the day.
It was an interesting statement in that I think it summarised the fears and anxieties that Australians had about a population, but also, I think, the aspirations for population and nation building.
So the concern, even though we were on the winning team in the Second World War, so the concern coming out of the Second World War was that this island continent had too small a population base to be able to defend itself. And that was the thing that flicked the switch in the governing psyche, moving us from a position of trying to maintain racial purity through white Australia to people. In the first instance with the Southern European influx and the Northern European influx, extending the immigration program in the first instance to non-English speakers.
That's writer George Megalogenis, and before him, the historian Gwenda Tavan. Looking back, the scale of the post-war immigration program was breathtaking. By 1950, almost 200,000 immigrants had arrived, primarily from Europe. 1 million more would arrive in each of the following 4 decades. The aim was nothing less than national reconstruction.
The £200 million Snowy River hydroelectric scheme will mean £20 million in production to Australia each year. Mr. McKell opens the vast project with a bang. In charge of this gigantic project is Commissioner Hudson, a man with a mighty big job. A £200 million project for a richer, more productive Australia.
The central character in the creation of this program was Arthur Calwell.
The more I focus on Arthur Calwell, the more impressed I am by the scope of his vision. He brought to the immigration portfolio an energy, a commitment and passion that was really quite remarkable, and I do think he gave it a particular stamp. But of course he wasn't an assimilationist. He'd expected that they would come and to a great degree integrate, assimilate into Australian society.
If we ask our new citizens to respect the Australian flag and swear allegiance to our concepts of government, we do so not because we want to regiment convenient cannon fodder for another war, but because we know from long experience that the democratic concepts we cherish offer adaptable and usable means for achieving social change and national progress without dangerous social dislocation or the chaotic spectacle of revolutionary disturbances ending in dictatorial minority rule.
That was the very first naturalisation ceremony conducted in Canberra in 1949. Of course, the demand on immigrants wasn't just that they join an Australian democracy. They were also expected to be part of an Australian nation defined by certain cultural values and social mores.
Hey you! Between that flag! Give us a hand with this drongo.
You've been in a rip. You know how dangerous those rips are?
I did not know.
Well, just stay between the flags in the future. Everything clear now?
Everything clear now. Good, and tell all your new Australian mates whether they're a bloody nuisance.
That's from They're a Weird Mob, a successful novel of the 1950s, later made into a popular film, and a reminder of the central place of the beach in the Australian way of life. If there was an underlying principle to assimilation, it was a white Australia.
It was both an ideal and a policy. I refer to it very often as a doctrine. So the doctrine itself was this idea that Australia should be maintained as a white British Australian nation, and that national prosperity and cohesion depended on a high degree of racial homogeneity and, you know, a great degree of cultural homogeneity. And the commitment to white Australia, paradoxically, one might think, was reinforced when the mass immigration program began in 1945 to 47, because, of course, governments kept promising the Australian people that that while, you know, a lot of immigrants were going to be coming from Europe, they would in no way touch the White Australia policy. It wasn't feasible to do that. So policy change happened very gradually over a period of almost 2 decades in very incremental forms, minor liberalisations that happened over time. The 2 major reforms were 1966 under the Holt Liberal government, and then the last phase of the dismantling was under the Whitlam government in 1973. Interestingly, both parties now want to claim credit for the end of the White Australia policy.
On our end, this is Mongrel Nation, the story of Australian multiculturalism. I'm Tim Soutphommasane. It was during the Whitlam government of the 1970s that any vestiges of assimilation in white Australia were eliminated. In its place was a new ideal of multicultural Australia. Immigrants were once expected to discard their cultural baggage. Now, it was something to be celebrated. The word multicultural entered the national vocabulary in August 1973 via the Immigration Minister, Al Grasby. His vision? Expanding the family of the nation.
The situation is that 1 person in 3, as you walk down the street at the present time, is a post-war migrant or the son or daughter or grandchild of one. So they're all part of the nation. Now, the one great difference has been that this hasn't been the theme of the family of the nation. Now, what I'm hoped to do, and with the full support of the government and everyone in it, is to build the family of the nation so that all the diversity is accepted, but there's got to be a single citizenship, a single dedication, and if somebody comes to you and says, what right have you got to speak? You've got an accent, or even if you wear a moustache, which shouldn't be a sin. Now, your answer is, I'm a citizen of this country, I have a right to so speak, and that's all you need. That's the qualification, the citizenship.
The policy of multiculturalism enjoyed bipartisan political support. Many associate its birth as much with Liberal Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser as with the Whitlam government and Al Grasby.
I believe we had no option, no alternative. We couldn't live as a Anglo-Saxon outpost in this part of the world. And I thought the days of isolation, of exclusivity, were just past. And I thought that sort of attitude was wrong. It was reminiscent of colonialism and a sense of superiority which was totally and absolutely misplaced. So how do you explain to a community that is, in its origins and in its attitudes, Caucasian, Anglo-Saxon, Celtic, how do you explain to that community that the world's changing, that they've got to change? And therefore you talked about multiculturalism, about a stronger country through diversity, respect for all people, and Australia just did not and does not have an alternative to multiculturalism.
Former Prime Minister Malcolm Fraser. In the 1970s, this young multicultural family had to make room for a new arrival.
The Saigon government has surrendered to the invading forces of the North Vietnamese and Viet Cong.
As we flew over the last bit of coast at Vung Tau, there was the most incredible Dunkirk scene. Flotillas of ships steaming out towards sea, loaded with refugees.
There were reports today that some of the recently arrived Vietnamese boat people may be sent back by the federal government. 112 refugees arrived in Darwin yesterday and another boatload of 50 today.
Well, we always have to maintain the right to decide who shall or shall not come into Australia.
There was clearly a refugee crisis by 1979. Camps throughout Southeast Asia were overflowing. Boats were arriving on Australian shores. The Department of Immigration and Ethnic Affairs warned that the arrival of these refugees would spark a hostile public reaction, stimulated by traditional fears of the yellow peril and concern about high unemployment.
Well, the Department of Immigration at the time also proposed reservoir detention centres located in Australian deserts, and we didn't give much time to those kinds of views which the department continued to express. I suppose one of the things I regret is that I didn't charge somebody, I'm not sure who it should have been, with the specific task of totally restructuring the Department of Immigration to get rid of the narrow gatekeeper attitudes which are still very much part of the department and which I believe have grown in strength in recent times.
By 1983...
Okay, that's the end of Part 1A of Mongrel Nation.